And so what I want to do this morning is I want to spend a little bit of time building a case for God's existence. I want to try to explain to you how I know there's a God. And this is what I would say to Provine when he says there is no God or there are no gods. Now, how would we begin trying to build a case for God's existence? Well, interestingly, Romans chapter 1 gives us a hint. So if you have a Bible, turn to Romans chapter 1. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Romans. Just kidding. Okay. All right, Romans chapter 1. I'll read verses 19 and 20 and then draw a conclusion from it. Verse 19 of Romans 1. Because what may be, now note carefully, not believed about God. It doesn't say what may be believed about God. It says what may be known about God is manifest in them because God showed it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood through my personal testimony. No. Being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. We learn from Romans that there is something about the created order that provides all people with a knowledge there is a supreme being. So what I would do with an atheist or with a person like Provine is I would see if I could formulate an argument that would provide evidence of God's existence not from Scripture, not from my changed life, but from the created world. And I want to try that this morning. And I hope to whet your appetite for this, and before we're finished, I'll suggest some things that you can do if you're interested in this kind of thing. But what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to give you 3 pieces of evidence for how I know God exists from the creation. 3 pieces of evidence for how I know there's a supreme being from the created world. None of this evidence requires faith. It doesn't take faith to believe in God. It takes faith to have a relationship with God, but belief in God is not a function of faith, it's a function of knowledge. Just like water's H2O, we know that, we don't have faith in that. So we know God exists, we don't have faith in that proposition, you can actually know there's a God. So 3 pieces of evidence that God exists. Number 1, the universe began to exist and something supernatural had to create it. The universe began to exist, and something supernatural had to create it. It's very interesting, brothers and sisters. We now know that we live in a very unusual universe. This universe has not been here forever. As a matter of fact, we now know beyond any reasonable doubt that the universe of space, time, and matter began to exist at a point in the past. We know this. 2 ways we know it. There are 4, but I'll give you 2 of them this morning. First of all, the second law of thermodynamics applied to the universe. The second law of thermodynamics applied to the universe. $1.98 word, but basically the second law of thermodynamics, when you apply it to the universe, says, basically this is the point, the universe is running out of gas. That's the point. We now know the universe is using up its useful energy. The energy in the universe that's useful is being burned up like fuel. You might want to think of the universe as an automobile with a limited amount of fuel in it that's being burned up as the car is driven. Or you might want to think of the universe as a watch that has been wound up and the battery is using up energy as the watch winds down. Now, what's eventually going to happen to that automobile? It's going to run out of gas. What's going to happen to the watch? It's going to stop because it's going to use up its fuel in the form of its battery. Now, Time magazine a few years ago ran a featured story on the cover as to how the universe is going to end. And in the Time magazine article, it said that our universe is 3 things are going to happen to the universe that we live in. Number 1, the lights are going to go out. Now, why is that? Well, where does light come from? It comes from stars, and more specifically, from nuclear reactions that are burning inside stars. Well, guess what's going to happen to the sun and all the stars eventually? those reactions are going to use up all the fuel that is contained in those stars, and every single one of them is going to go out. There's not going to be any light any longer anywhere. Secondly, the heat's going to go out. Somebody's going to turn the heat off. And that's for the same reason that the nuclear reactions generating heat are going to be burned up, and there will no longer be any fuel to generate heat anywhere in the universe. Third and finally, the universe is going to become motionless. That's called the quiescent universe. The universe is going to reach a point where there will no longer be any motion in it. Now, can you understand that if the universe never had a beginning, that means it's always been here? And if it's always been here, and it's using up its fuel, it should have used up its fuel infinitely long ago. Or to put the point a little bit differently, if the universe didn't have a beginning, we should have already reached the point where there was no light, no heat, and no motion. Because we haven't reached that point yet, and because the universe is running out of its energy, there had to be a point here where it began. And as one British scientist, Paul Davies, said, it looks like there was a time when the universe was wound up, and it's winding down ever since. That's the first piece of evidence that the universe had a beginning. Here's the second piece of evidence that the universe had a beginning. The galaxies are all expanding away from one another through time. You might want to look at it like this. The galaxies are all expanding away from one another through time. People used to think the galaxies were motionless or stable, but we know that's not true any longer. We now know that the galaxies are actually moving, and they're all flying away from each other. Think of it like this. Suppose I had a balloon that I blew up and had about a third of it blown up, and I put dots on the surface of the balloon with a pen. And let's let the ink dots represent, each one represent a galaxy. What would happen if I blew the balloon up again? What would happen to those dots relative to each other? You understand they would expand away from one another. That is exactly what's happening to the universe. Each galaxy is moving away as time goes on from all the other galaxies. But then, as scientists have pointed out, if you extrapolate backwards and shrink the balloon, what happens is they keep coming closer and closer together until you get a point where the entire universe of space, time, and matter spring into existence. How do I know the universe began to exist? A, the second law tells us it's using up its fuel. It couldn't have been doing that forever. It would have already used it all up, so the past has to be finite. And if the past is finite, there was a start to time. B, the universe is expanding away. All the galaxies are flying away from one another. If you extrapolate back in time, you reach the beginning point when the universe comes into existence. Now, if you have something winding down, and if it was wound up, there has to be a winder-upper. If you have a big bang, as Ted Koppel said once on Nightline, it seems to me there has to be a big banger. And here's why. Here's why. You cannot get something from nothing. You can't get something springing into existence from nothing without anything causing it. It is impossible to get something from nothing without any cause whatsoever. But do you see what this means? This means that since the universe began to exist, the natural world began to exist, something supernatural, completely outside the universe, had to cause it to come into existence. That is the only rational explanation for the origin of the universe, is that there was, in fact, a supernatural cause for the universe beginning to exist. Now, I don't have time this morning, but I could give reasons for why we know this cause had to be personal and had to have the power of free will. But those kinds of arguments can be advanced. So that's argument number one as to how I know there's a God.